Gordon, when we see these scenes outside Downing Street, we witnessed riots previously in Southport on the evening of those dreadful attacks on the girls at the Taylor Swift dance group. We've also seen riots in Hare Hills. There seems to be a common factor, and that is that they are thugs, probably hard right thugs, who have some connection with either Tommy Robinson, the English Defence League, the EDL, or maybe they've just turned up spoiling for a fight. Here's what Keir Starmer said earlier during a Downing Street press conference which followed a meeting with police leaders.
These thugs are mobile. They move from community to community. And we must have a policing response that can do the same. Shared intelligence, wider deployment of facial recognition technology, and preventative action, criminal behaviour orders to restrict their movements before they can even board a train, in just the same way that we do with football hooligans.
It's all quite confusing, isn't it, to see, in response to, in Southport's case, this major investigation involving members of frontline services, then coming under attack by a baying mob. That is odd.
Yeah, and we've had Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, suggesting that she could proscribe the EDL as a terror group. This was what she said on LBC.
And an organisation called the EDL, we know that it is. The police know that it is. And there may be others on the fringes of it.
We have laws and we have prescribed groups, and we do look at that. And
I'm wondering whether it's time for them to be considered to be in.
And it is reviewed regularly, so I'm sure that will be something that the Home Secretary will, be looking at as part of the normal course of what we do and the intelligence that we have. But I think the bigger issue is about taking on the minority of people that have got thuggish behaviour, that actually that's not our British values. It's not the people of Southport that we've seen doing the work today. It's not what people want in their hour of grief. People are upset, they're traumatised, they want the facts, and they want to know what we're doing to do everything we can to prevent a horrific situation like that ever happening again, reviewing to see if there's something more that we could do, and also making sure that we're doing everything in our powers to stop this kind of violence on the streets wherever it comes from, because that there's laws against that. That is not a protest. Lobbing bricks at police, setting fire to police vans is not a protest. That are thugs, and they should be dealt with the full weight of the law.
Is that even possible, though? Because the weird thing about the EDL, it sort of was born out of the British National Party, which has subsequently sort of folded. Nick Griffin, its former leader, sort of castigated in the sort of racist pile, never to be touched again. So you've got some people associated with the EDL, even though it doesn't have a membership structure, it doesn't have a website. Many people say it doesn't really exist, it's sort of disbanded. So they're kind of campaigning under that banner. Then you've got groups of football hooligans who form another sort of subgroup of this whole movement. Then I think you have just got people jumping on the bandwagon. It's a strange, eclectic bunch. And the question that we're trying to answer is, what motivates those who take part in these sorts of demonstrations? What's the reason for it all? And can anything be done to stop it?
Yeah, well, joining us now is Ivan Humble, who's a former member of the English Defence League. He now works with various groups, including Muslim groups, and goes into schools to try and promote better understanding and try to stop these sort of things happening in future.
Ivan Humble, welcome to the Daily Tea.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You've got quite an interesting history, Ivan. You're now based in Lowestoft, but you were sort of groomed into the EDL. You were dissatisfied with local issues. You became somebody quite prominent in the organisation. You were their regional organiser. And then you had an epiphany and decided that this wasn't the direction you wanted your life to take. Just explain that a little bit.
All right, so just quickly on that, you said about being groomed into it. I was groomed into it, but not by the usual channels people think. So for me, my personal story was obviously 2009, the Troops Homecoming Parade, where we witnessed Ajahn Chowdhury and his group abuse our soldiers. It was him that I started researching and becoming very knowledgeable on his interpretation of Islam. And then the epiphany moment was, I was involved in hate for about 5 to 6 years. And in that time, nobody wanted to sit down and speak to me. It took the person I hated the most, my enemy, the Muslim with the brown skin and the big beard, to actually sit me down and listen to what I had to say. And from that led me to 2.5 years of conversations to educate myself on my misconceptions.
Yes.
And then I was able to walk away from that life.
And that was Manwar Ali. So that's a self-proclaimed former jihadist, also from your neck of the woods, from Ipswich. And basically, these two people, somebody in the EDL, a reformed jihadist, get together, you form a strong friendship, and you both work out that actually what you'd rather do than sort of conspire in sort of feelings of hatred and division, that you want to try and bring communities together.
Yeah, it's for me personally, is that lack of being heard, or I was heard, but I was labelled. It's like what we're seeing nowadays is years and years of people being unheard, and now it's come to that boiling point where people need to be heard. We can't keep labelling people and shutting down conversations that need to be had.
Can you tell us what your thoughts are about what's happened in Southport before we go on?
I think the violence is disgusting. There was no need for the violence. But at the same time, I kind of understand some of the people's anger. It never justifies the level of violence we see there, though, don't get me wrong. And at the same time, it's the internet's to blame as well for a lot of this misinformation, people managing to fit things to their own narratives. And online, you can whip up a storm in seconds.
Yeah, so Ivan, explain it to us then, because you say the EDL's been disbanded. It's hard even to kind of trace its history. Maybe it was born out of the collapse of the BNP. It doesn't have a website. It doesn't really have a sort of membership structure. And obviously you've got the Tommy Robinson factor and his supporters in the mix. So when we see periods of unrest which are associated with the EDL, or at least sort of the far right in inverted commas, how do those gatherings come about? Is it some football hooligans, some EDL former members, some Tommy Robinson supporters? How do these people sort of galvanise on the streets like we saw outside Downing Street last night?
Look, not everybody on the streets last night in London and in Southport were members of the far right. Lots of them were local people with local issues, lots of anger and frustration. And when we're not having the national conversations on controversial issues that affect everybody, then the far right will own that narrative and that conversation. That's how they're able to embottle so many people on the streets, because there's so much anger and frustration on there. Nobody else is talking about the issues they are. That's what gives them the support they're getting.
Obviously, we've heard Angela Rayner talking about proscribing the EDL. Presumably, from what you're saying, you think that would be a waste of time, do you? Because it effectively doesn't exist and can just change its name at any point.
Yeah, they should learn the lessons from before. Deplatforming don't really work. Look at Ajahn Chowdhury, for example. He's only just been put in prison for life after running a proscribe group for years. So does the prescription really work? Does deplatforming work? It just pushes vulnerable people into darker spaces on the internet. Have discussions and open debate. To have open debate around these issues. That way, nobody can be pulled down a rabbit hole.
The internet seems to have pulled people down some kind of rabbit hole. We had a lot of misinformation, which you've mentioned, Ivan, about who might have been responsible for the Southport attack. The proceedings are active, so we need to be very careful about discussing anything related to that suspect who has now been charged. But the internet has added a whole new dimension. I mean, these groups have always been around. They've been around for decades. How has the pattern of some of these protests and indeed some of this activity changed since you've been witnessing it?
I think that the biggest change is the numbers now on the streets. With EDL, we had some big numbers on certain demonstrations, but Tommy's done 2 demonstrations in the last 2 months that were really well attended. The first one in June had 1 arrest, and I think there's 9 arrests in this one. So the support is growing because we're not having these public conversations. Controversial figures have been able to own their conversations and then own the narrative.
What is Tommy Robinson's appeal, and why does he have such a big following?
I think it's because he speaks about things that affect the ordinary people, that the MPs don't really affect them because they're not living where we're living. I'm not saying Tommy's right on everything he says, but you have to look through the narrative at some of the finer genuine concern. We can't just keep denying there's problems or there's no problems with immigration when there are problems, where local people are seeing the difference. We need to start having open, honest conversations about various issues. We need to reclaim the conversations back.
And is that why people end up sort of being driven to these far-right organisations, do you think? Is it because they're racists, or is it because they feel that nobody's speaking for the things that they care about?
It's a bit of both, right? Don't get me wrong, there are some racist people out there, I can't deny that, but what I'm seeing online and the people I speak to is there's many people who are sitting on the fence kind of thing, who have an opinion, but they're not prepared to do anything with it yet. But the more people are shut down, the more people are labelled, and that it's just the anger turns to frustration, and then the frustration gets people on the streets.
Mm. When you say that people turn to Tommy Robinson because they don't feel anyone speaks for them, there is an elected politician that does call out mass immigration, that does ask questions about sectarian politics, and that's Nigel Farage. What's your view of him, Ivan?
He's one of them politicians as well. He speaks some of the things. He speaks what the public are thinking. That's what makes him attractive to people. He's only focused on a couple of things where other political parties feature more issues. Do you know what I mean? He's just like not a one-trick pony, but he just concentrates on the immigration because that's where he gets his support from. And that is one of the biggest issues facing the UK at the minute, is immigration.
What can we do to quickly try to calm the tension that's out there in the country right now? I know you've talked about we need to have more discussions, but is there anything, what would you do today, effectively, to try to stop some of the things that we've seen over the last couple of days happening again?
That's a good question, because I don't know if there's anything we could do today that would stop anything happening in the future, because the anger and the frustration is already there. We need to find a way to quell that a little bit. I haven't got the answer to that at this minute in time. Do you know what I mean? Because there's no instant thing you can do to make things better. We've tried for years sticking plasters on an open wound, and this is the manifestations of that. We can't keep doing that. We have to really think about things and try and take things back our way. Do you know what I mean? By having the public conversations. It's only by educating people on the real problems that we can get through the misinformation.
But it
is a hard battle when you're competing against groups is easy, but you're competing against the internet. It's not just people in our country adding the misinformation; it's all over. The problem is the internet. Do you know what I mean? A lot of this anger and frustration has stemmed from, you could say, from COVID times when we were all locked down and stuck in our houses for days after days, with most people just no work, probably sitting online, getting involved in arguments they wouldn't usually do, and end up down that rabbit hole into an echo chamber, which is probably where a lot of the country is at the minute, in echo chambers, because for a year odd we couldn't do enough, we couldn't leave our house. So a lot of our life was on social media.
When you talk about immigration being one of the reasons, you've talked a lot about people not feeling that they're heard or listened to, a deep amount of anger and frustration. So some of it's directed at immigration. What else are people angry and frustrated about, Ivan, that join in these protests?
Blimey. you could say some of the anti-Muslim hatred is not justified, but when you have, in the build-up to the election, when you see like Muslims trying to control the narrative on the politicians who didn't vote for Gaza, things like that that sort of gives people justification to think that when they think about Muslims taking over, it's true, because they see Muslims saying things like this. But what they don't see is all the other Muslims standing up to them people. We don't see them being challenged. For example, when I was getting involved in EDL research and in Chowdhury, from the town I live, I had my perception of Muslims because of Ajahn Chowdhury. I didn't see nobody in my town challenging him because my town was a white town. We didn't have hardly any Muslims. And back then, Ajahn Chowdhury was the Muslim on the TV, was the Muslim on the documentaries, was everywhere. So coming from a town I come from, seeing him on the TV, for me, he's the spokesman for the UK Muslim community. We didn't see no other voices back then.
Can you explain, Ivan? I think one of the things that people will have found really difficult to understand and particularly shocking, certainly in Southport, on the day after these stabbings, was that you had people throwing bricks and rocks at the police, and the police were the ones who were, the first responders at the scene of that stabbing. Can you try and explain in any way what is going through these people's minds when they have got a grievance and they decide that the police should be the ones that they are attacking?
Oh, I can't even excuse that. Do you know what I mean? I can't even think of a reason why people would do that sort of thing. There's no justification for that kind of violence. Do you know what I mean? But like, if you look at what people are saying online at some of the influencers sort of thing, it's because they seem to think, I see a couple of posts on Twitter early today before I come on here, and people were like talking about this two-tier policing. When you look at, say, for example, I think somebody gave a comparison of that trouble in Hare Hills in Leeds the other week. I'm guessing what I'm trying to say is people looking at that kind of thing are thinking the only way they're going to get heard is through violence and rioting. It's just a weird way of them getting their justification for doing that.
Is there not an element, though, here of people who just want to cause trouble, who just want to have a Barney, who just want to, it's kind of like football hooliganism being not really much to do with football. Are there people who will travel to somewhere where there is unrest in order to throw stones at the police because that's what they want to do?
Yeah, don't get me wrong, there probably is people like that. But when people have been talking about Southport and London, they're talking about people in general. They're stereotyping all the people the same. Not everybody who was there that day was far right. It's just an easy label to throw around now when the discussion's not going your way or somebody doesn't agree with your viewpoint. And that's what I mean about politics. You can't work out solutions and policies if you don't hear every member of the public, whether their view is right or not. You still need to take their view into consideration when you're making changes for the people.
When you finally, Ivan, we've talked about obviously immigration and dissatisfaction with disproportionate policing. Are there other just economic factors at play here? You've mentioned people being grounded during COVID. They couldn't earn. I don't know whether these are people that necessarily would have got furlough. Are people feeling left behind economically as well? And then that is fueling some of this?
Yeah, that's like I said, this problem is multi-faced, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? There's so many different issues that it's leading. It's like we've got all these issues put in a saucepan, for example, that's on boil. And at the minute, we're reaching boiling point. I think we need to, obviously, there's lots of good groups and organisations out in the community doing good work, but they're restricted by lack of funding or even being given a chance to do the work they're trying to do to make things better. Some people just aren't interested, which is why I do what I do with the Me and You education, is going to schools, talk about identity, belonging, and and counter-narratives towards racism and hatred.
Just
To be fair, when I go into a lot of schools that are so mixed now that it does give me a bit of hope that because they've already got to know each other and know the other person, where in my time, I never had that experience at school. I do think that we are going to see a change, but not yet. It won't probably be our children, it'll be our children's where the change come from, because they're more used to getting on with each other and understanding the differences. Where the older generation, like myself, we're a bit set in our ways. We don't like change. That's probably a big part of this as well. We don't like change, but the youth, they're getting used to these changes because they're growing up with it.
Well, I think that's probably a hopeful note, perhaps to end on. I would hope it maybe won't be our children's children, but maybe our children and the current generation. But
you've got to have hope. You've got to have hope to believe there's going to be change. Do you know what I mean? And that's the hope that I carry. Is that sooner or later our children will pick up the reins and things will be different. It's just going to be a bit hard work till then.
Ivan Humble, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Tea.